structure to academic structure at that time, he included himself amongst these people. He was a painter and architect at the same time. So, yeah, next slide. So yes, amongst the many people he included, he's there in the middle, amongst all the other ones that we now know as sort of Renaissance geniuses, if you like. However, the important thing is that the way he structured the book is biographies of each of those. And instead of giving a paramount, if you like, homogeneous style as a label to all of them, he singled each one out and spoke a bit of how they came to be as apprentices in a master's office, studio, and in their own right, over some years, innovated, developed certain techniques, whether it's fresco, mixtures of paint, sculpture, etc., to become masters in their own right. So he's interested in each specific person and their biographies. Style is associated with an individual and a particular technique that they've mastered and continue to master throughout their lifetime. So each one might, he describes how each one might have developed early on a certain type of painting or sculpture, but it then went on to develop others. The important thing here is that a style is not homogeneous to one person, and that's their only style. It changes during their biography, but also it's not homogeneous across a whole period. And that's generally how we tend to understand it nowadays. If you talk to journalists or opinion makers, art historians, etc., for very good reason, because we need to rationalize, categorize. It's much easier to homogenize at the same time, and with inevitable outliers as a result. I think you can just roll through these. So those are the baptistry gates. So that was obviously a silversmith. So somebody who was trained as a silversmith, who was invited to a competition. His training had already singled him out as being rather exceptional. So he wasn't interested just in the method of silversmithing, but he was also a reader, a humanist reader, what we call humanist. So he was outside the iconic, the tradition of icon making, reading humanism at the time, and therefore, if you like, taking lessons from the sculptures and of classicism, and bringing that back into his small works for churches and cathedrals of that time, and singling himself out as a result of going from the tradition into something that today we recognize as the classical tradition. And similarly with drawing, you can roll through these. Sculpture, so obviously this is the Renaissance period, this is Vasari singling these people out. And then obviously development of perspective, and then how those become manifest in bill forms. Yeah. So Vasari's book lasted as the definition of history of art, architecture, sculpture for about 200 years. He actually wrote, it was a bestseller, he wrote a second book. The second book slightly undermines my argument, but the second book, he had complaints that he hadn't included anybody outside Florence. So he began to include Venetians, and because he's Florentine, he became slightly prejudiced against the Venetians, and if you like, almost defined Venetian style to the Florentine. But the principal point is that he's identifying individuals and their processes. So the key thing here is process that derives a product. So 200 years later we have Johann Winkelmann, who is searching for particular classical sculptures. We were discussing this earlier today with some of your colleagues, and I think it was Antinius, for the cult of Antinius, the sculptures for them. And during that period, he effectively became the first archaeologist, because this was the period of the Enlightenment, so he's trying to be a bit more empirical without simply digging stones up, looking at them, throwing them back down. So he's properly mapping where he's digging, as it were, and reimagining how those might be re-erected. So his first book is the art of antiquity, so he includes Greek and Roman, and specifically their sculptures and architecture. If you roll through. Now, of course, what Winkelmann wasn't aware of, this is obviously, apart from the ruins, he's obviously coming across pretty much built, complete forms. But what he wasn't aware of, because is that all these were polychromatic. So his first book is pretty much an analysis. You could almost call it a proper academic study, the birth of archaeology and art history. The second book, he actually does label, he's careful to label it, title it as His Opinions. And now, that was far more important in the end, because his opinions, his personal opinion was a preference for Greek to Roman. Partly proportional, but mostly because he wanted to conflate the politics, what he felt were the more democratic politics of Greek compared to imperial autocratic Rome. And he said the aesthetics are derived from a more democratic society. So remember, this is his opinion in the period of the Enlightenment, where the period of the Enlightenment was already beginning to slightly try to shirk off the autocratic rule of absolute monarchy. So the idea of those style being conflated with politics is something that was highly attractive to the environment. If you carry on. Obviously today we know most of what he thought was pure white, bleached sculpture and architecture was actually polychromatic. So there's some errors in his thinking, but he describes how the purity of that white marble is as pure as the democratic difference between Greek and Roman. So you can see there's he's not a craftsman, he's not an architect, he's not a painter. He's a proto-archaeologist. In his second book, conflating his opinions with style. However, as a result of that, the book becomes a bestseller. It's, again, for at least the next 200 years, dictating the idea that style is conflated with, if you like, a morality, a political morality. If you carry on. The errors he makes, obviously, apart from not realizing that there's a polychrome to the work, if you carry on, is that the stone is an abstraction of how buildings were made originally. So it's millennia of abstraction of original construction, as it were. While the people that Vasari is writing about are the people who are making, whether it's architecture or painting or sculpture, they are the makers, and they understand the processes of making. They even understand the processes of abstraction of the making. So they have the vocabulary and the ability to play with that knowledge. So if we carry on to the next slide. And of course, what happens is that during the 18th century, 19th century, the neoclassical period is born. It's very easy to mimic. You're effectively just mimicking drawings and their details from a pattern language. There's no sort of, if you like, innovation. So we don't get the Borrominis, Berninis, etc. during that period until another generation. I think you can again keep scrolling through the next slides because they pretty much tell the same story. Obviously, the idea of bleachedness and whiteness and purity transcends not just the neoclassical but also into the modern. So the lesson of all that is that whatever those materials are, it's the understanding of their structural, tactile, textural qualities. If it's a deep understanding that as a craftsman, as an architect you have, you're able to not just use them but you're able to dictate to structural engineers and others an understanding that helps to hopefully bring about a building that's made of those materials. So you're not directing ultimately just a facade that is a style of a particular period that you've adopted, that is then made behind, supported behind by the structural engineer, quantity surveyor, I'm sure you have them here, cost consultants, etc. An understanding of those materials allows you to do that, to understand from first principles how a building is put together, and therefore the ultimate, the final result of that building is not an end product to forgetting the process result. So it's not having a drawing, a pattern book from which you then allow somebody else to dictate how the structure is made. You are thinking from first principles, how is this building put together, and can the influence of those materials actually dictate the ultimate result? So yeah, we come up more close. If you just roll through. So, has this got a laser on it? Shall I try? It's got a laser. No laser? No? Oh. No point in you putting it together. Okay, in the, I'll just leave the microphone for a second. Just up there, so that's the walled city of London. Just on the north, outside the city walls, is where the cattle markets were, and fields with nothing on them. This is a map that was drawn in the Middle Ages. Our site is in those fields. Well, actually, if you go on to the next slide, it'll highlight the structure. So yeah, that was the recording of our site. And you can see there's an enclave. That's actually an Augustinian nunnery. That nunnery was built in the late 11th century, so around about 1090, by the Norman invaders. So if you know, the Normans were actually Vikings that spent their time going backwards and forwards across the North Sea, eventually settled in northern France, a group of them, and eventually, with the King of France, became formalized as part of that country as barons, principally to stop them taking over the rest of France. Now their skill was, amongst being good warriors, their skill was to create, they found quarries of limestone, and they realized by excavating that limestone while it was still soft, it was easy to carve, make quite strong interlocking block fortifications, and so this is around about 800, so for about 200 years until they invaded England. They effectively invaded land, made strong fortifications to keep that land, and carried on invading parts of France until they made this deal with the king. At the same time, at that deal, they agreed not to be pagan anymore. They became Christian, and not long after, they fell out with their associate, if you like, who promised them the throne of England, took it for himself, and they invaded England. And in that process, they got rid of the entire English aristocracy, what you call the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, and replaced it with their own barons. So it was classic invasion. Language changed to French amongst the aristocracy. And every baron who took the land had to take it forcefully. And because they'd become Christian, they all knew that ultimately they're going to go to hell for the amount of killing they had to do. But at that period, you could buy yourself out of hell by essentially building a monastery, or having an abbey, an abbess or abbot sign a certificate if you gave part of your wealth. So instead of giving half your wealth, you might actually build a monastery. Baron Jordan Brissett built a monastery here. He put his wife in as the chief abbess, and used limestone to build the original buildings. It was the first in this area, so it's quite unique to England. And the abbey flourished for 500 years. As you know, Henry VIII needed to get remarried, and for that he basically adopted the Protestant faith, became head of the church to be able to get married. in that process, he realised he had to dismantle the Catholic Church in England, which basically meant all the wealth of the Catholic Church could go to him, the state. The top left is one of the noblemen he sent there to dismantle the abbey. The nobleman took it as his private palace. Unfortunately, his children fell out with the next monarchs and were beheaded, and the family exiled out of London, and the land taken by the state, by the monarchy. The next person you see is Oliver Cromwell. So he dismantled the monarchy at that time through a civil war, and became essentially dictator for life, because